What is good, people? Zensphere back again, here with another RENOISE tutorial. Today we are going to be examining native drum synthesis. So creating your own drum sounds from scratch within RENOISE. This can be pretty easily done, depending on how detailed of a result you're looking for and the particular style of music that you're creating as well, because the percussion tends to be a pretty characteristic element of any genre, and so the specific drum sounds that you want to create might be a little different than these ones, but let's just dive in and let's see what we can do here. So first of all, we're going to need to start with a waveform. Let's start out with a kick drum. I pulled up a sine wave from Adventure Kids Waveforms, and I'm just going to tune this so we're in C. So down 2 semitones and 2 128ths in our fine tune. And we've got a nice low C. If you're listening on a phone, maybe you can hear that, I don't know. And a lot of kick drums are essentially just pitch bent sine waves, so that's where we're going to start here. I produce a lot of sidetrance, so sidetrance kicks are pretty simple in that regard. That they're mostly just pitch bent sine waves. So we're over here in our modulation tab, went down to pitch, and I just bumped our pitch range up to 96 semitones. And I'm going to bring in, let's just bring in a fader. Actually, no, let's do this with the ADHSR or AHDSR. So we'll set attack to 0, sustain to, let's turn this to unipolar. Sustain to 0. And this way, when we finish our ramp down of pitch, we'll land on the note of the key that we're pressing. So this will allow you to tune your kick drum by having this in unipolar mode as opposed to bipolar. And then release we can take down. We're just going to be concerned with this decay value here and the decay scaling here. So as it is, it sounds like this. Yeah, that sounds a lot like a kick drum. Let's tighten it up here. Okay, now we're starting to get into the territory. This decay scaling is really instrumental here because it alters the shape of the curve. So we can have a tighter attack characteristic. A lot of kind of old school synth drums don't have, they just have this kind of straight ramp down sound. That's a very old school kind of sound. So let's tighten this up. Just want a nice sharp click. And so when you're making a kick, at least in some styles, you're going to be concerned with the tuning of the kick. So you want to think about your sub frequencies. The most audible range for sub frequencies are, I'd say, anywhere from like E to A. So F is a good choice. So let's go with F here. And I'm going to pull up our spectrum analyzer. So we can see we have our nice click up here around 5K. I think I want a little more click, so I'm going to pull back on the scaling here. Sidetrance, you want a nice sharp transient. And I might pull this out a little bit. There, that's sounding pretty good. So we got 33 milliseconds here and a value of negative 0.19. And then let's go and create an amplitude envelope here. So I want to use just the envelope modulation device. And I've got a few different presets saved here, but let's just start from 0 here, and we'll just delete everything here. And it's important to kind of look at the size of your window. We want to make this a nice small window. but sometimes it can be useful to look at your kick drum in relation to your rhythmic structure. So depending on whatever tempo you're going to be working at, if you turn this clock off, you can sync to beats instead of milliseconds. And again, depending on the style, you might want your kick to be really long and boomy, or you might want it to be short and more percussive. I like to make my side kicks pretty short these days, although I've definitely used some boomy kicks in the past, just so it doesn't interfere with the bass as much, and then it's a little easier to avoid phasing issues between the kick and the bass. So we're just going to create a nice short, kind of sharp amplitude envelope. Okay, that's sounding pretty good to me. Oh, I always forget that you lose your curve when you introduce a new point. Or rather, the curve goes to the left of the point that you insert. Now, there are things that you can do with this amplitude envelope to shape the character of your kick. Because we have a pitch bent sine wave, we have frequencies across the time domain. So basically at the very beginning, we have a very high frequency, which rapidly decreases to our kind of stable fundamental frequency. And by attenuating different portions of the amplitude envelope, we can alter the frequency characteristics of the sound. So for instance, I can cut out some mid-range by altering this amplitude envelope. I can alter the level of transient by attenuating the very beginning of the waveform. This is a perfectly valid approach and works for kind of cutting out the mud in the kind of 200 to 500 hertz range out of your kicks. But sometimes it can make your kick sound a little disjointed. So there's another technique that I like to use, and by disjointed I mean that you kind of can hear the transient and then you can hear the body of the kick, and it sounds a little bit disconnected. This kick is short enough that you're not really hearing that, but it's not as tight as I want it to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this, and we'll actually render this out. We're actually most of the way there for creating our kick. So I'm just going to record my F note here, and then we'll select this note column and we'll render it out. And now we have a rendered kick drum here. Go back to our waveform view and let's clean this up. I'm going to adjust it to mono because who needs stereo when it's your kick, right? And you can see that we have a nice consistent waveform here. When we maximize it, it's not going to give us any surprises, except it's really loud now. So this is our 4th octave. Okay, nice, sharp, snappy kick. But we can see we have all this content here that we could maybe clean up a little bit. Now, because RENOISE is a sampler, I like to take care of this at the sample level. What we can do is we'll turn our snap onto a 0 crossing, and you can see here how this is a high frequency sine wave going into a lower frequency sine wave. And ultimately, it creates this kind of stable fundamental about from here on out. So we want to look for a single cycle that may be in the kind of 200 to 500 hertz range. And look at that, we found it. So what I did was I turned my snap on to 0. I selected a single cycle of this wave, and then I hit Command-Shift-L to loop it. And then it's just freezing at this point here. And then I can select the loop with Command-L, and then I'm just going to cut it out. Now, we do have this issue where the waveform kind of bends really dramatically. But if we select here and smooth it out using the smooth waveform key, which I have tied to a hotkey here. We'll have to do that a number of times. We can kind of smooth out that angle just so it isn't such an abrupt transition. Now, I'm not entirely sure that that makes a difference, but it looks nicer. And you can see how we have this little dip here around 200 where we cut out that wave cycle. I'm going to turn this scale to minutes and seconds. So we're at about 60 milliseconds here, 180 milliseconds. Let's actually look at it on beats. So 1.8 is going to be half of our 16 beat because this scale goes up to 1.15, and then at 16 it repeats. So this kick is a little long for my taste. I want it kind of maybe more around 1.5 or 1.6. So then again, I'm just going to select a single cycle here, and I'm going to cut it out. And I've shortened my kick to 1.6. Let's hear how it sounds. Oops. Take the looping off. We don't need the loop. It sounds nice and tight and chunky. Now, this transient is maybe a little loud. If I wanted to bring it down, I could just select this portion, and then we can adjust the volume here with F10. And what I like to do is just bring it down a little bit, maybe 0.1 or 0.2, hit process, and then you can use the F10 key toggled with enter to kind of dial in the level that you're looking for. That sounds a little better to my ears. That's a nice, tight, sharp transient, but not overwhelming transient. Decent full body. That should translate well to working at this BPM range of around 150. Okay, so that's basically a psytrance kick in RENOISE. Pretty simple. You can get kind of more advanced with it, but sometimes simple is best. If you are looking for a different kind of sound, you can definitely play with effects. You can add some compression or maybe some distortion or cabinet simulator to kind of dirty up the kick a little bit. Let's hear what that sounds like if we add in a cabinet simulator. See, already there's quite a bit more organic character. And if I were going for a different style, I might want to take that transient down a bit. So what we can do is we can go back into our volume envelope and kind of create, let's see, I want to bring this down to, let's do this at 1 beat again, because that really just helps me see where we are. I could still bring the transient down here. And then we have a totally different style of kick. You could resample this, render it out, so you don't have to worry about any discrepancies that, timing jitter or anything that might arise with constantly retriggering the envelopes or the effects rendering differently. So you can just freeze this and then use it. Really useful for kind of building your own drum library, just synthesizing and then freezing and storing these various samples. Okay, so let's move on to a snare drum. It's going to be a very kind of similar process. We'll start with a sine wave. You could use a triangle wave, but we want to create the body of the snare first. And it's going to be, as I said, very similar. I'm just going to bring my pitch all the way up so I have the maximum range to work with. And I will bring in another AHDSR, bring the attack value down, sustain to 0, bring this to unipolar, release to 0. Release doesn't actually matter here. And then we'll bring decay down to, again, around about 30 milliseconds. And this time we're looking for a higher pitch, maybe something in the 3rd octave or so. Oh, I forgot about tuning. So we'll tune this. And again, depending on your style, you might want your snare to be in the same key as your kick, as your fundamental note of your bass line. If you're writing in a specific key, sometimes it's nice to tune your snares too. So let's find a decent range here. Okay, that's going to be closer to what we're looking for. And let's bring in the amplitude envelope. And again, we just want 1 beat. And actually, let's turn this to milliseconds because we want a fairly short body to the snare, maybe around 60 milliseconds or so. Really doesn't have to be that much. Now that transient, that click, is a little too high for my taste. So what we can do is let's bring in an operand and we'll put this on multiply. And then we can dial in the pitch range just to our liking without having to change this. That's another way you could do it. You could not have this and just change it here. But sometimes it's nice to have the visual, visual feedback. There, that sounds about right to my ear. And we just want this kind of short body. Again, I'm working in F. We'll just kind of keep it consistent with the snare, or with the kick rather. And obviously that doesn't sound very much like a snare, but we're not done yet. I think I want to reshape this envelope a little bit here. I think what I'm going to do is something like this. And we'll bring this down. Yeah, that sounds a little better to me. Okay, now we need the tail of our snare. I like to use pink noise. So I'm just going to grab a pink noise sample. And I've got a minute of pink noise, which is way too much. But you can hear it's running through the same modulation set as our sine wave. So let's write this as body. We'll create a new modulation set and we'll assign the noise to this second set and we'll rename this tail. Okay, so now we have as much length as we want. Let's cut some of this out because we don't need that whole sample taking up memory in the song. So let's just, let's grab an 8th note. That should be enough, I think. This is not enough. What are you thinking? Okay. 8th, quarter note. We'll just grab a full beat. That's a really long tail. So obviously this is interfering with the sound of the body. So we want to create another amplitude envelope. And let's turn this to 1 beat. We'll bring this down, have it fade in. And I'm actually not liking this pink noise. I think I'm actually gonna go for some white noise with this one. So usually pink noise sounds good, but for some reason it's not quite doing it for me. And let's put this on tail. bring the level down a little. And then this is really just about fine-tuning your envelopes. Okay, let's render that. See how it sounds. Okay, now we have our rendered snare. Let's take a look at it. Sometimes that's useful. We'll maximize that. Okay, we have kind of a decent shape, but you can see the tail is maybe a little too quiet. So I'm going to go back. We'll just delete this, and we'll bring the tail level up. And we're not going to worry about the dynamics at this point. We're just trying to kind of dial in the basic shape and sound. Okay. Okay, so that's a little better. I tend to like snares with like a abrupt cut. I think I want it shorter than that. 16, let's go to 32. Add another 30-second. It's still a little long for me. Again, this is going to vary depending on your style. And then I maybe fade this out at the end. Okay. Now I think I want to bring this level up a little bit. So I'm going to pull up my volume adjustment, and we'll just, again, alternating between F10 and enter, we can kind of gradually raise and lower the volume. Now, that's not always going to work with a given sample, just to grab a kind of arbitrary cut point and alter the amplitude, because you may get some, some clicking or some artifacts, but this is noise that we're dealing with. It's not really going to matter. Nice sharp transient. Sometimes, again, depending on the style of music, you might want a softer transient. I'm going to bring this body down a little bit. It's feeling a little loud for me. You can, of course, do all this with envelopes. Sometimes it's nice to just work in the waveform view. You can really get precise. Also, depending on your style, you might not want a transient at the beginning of your snare. Like for instance, in trance music, you have the kick drum on every beat and the snare is on 2 and 4. So your transients are adding up on 2 and 4. So one way you can help the dynamics of your mix is to kind of fade in your transient with a short fade here. So you could do something like that, which sounds kind of like bullshit. But when you're actually triggering the snare with the kick, you just hear the transient of the kick, and your brain sort of fills in the rest. This might be a little bit long for a fade in. You could do something maybe half that length. Just turn the snap off. Do something like this, fade it in. And that sounds more like a snare. And added with the transient of a kick, that would be perfectly, you wouldn't even notice. You just would notice that your mix wasn't clipping as much, which is great. So let's take that off for now because we want to hear our transient. And You can see that this is a pretty full frequency sound. What we might want to do is get into our effects and add some filtering. I'm just going to bring up, well, we'll do it this way. We'll add a digital filter and we'll put it on high pass. Go to Butterworth 8N. Nice clean shelf. And around 200 hertz, kilohertz. Sorry, around 200 hertz. We don't want to lose the fundamental of the body. We want to keep the body. You can also maybe low pass some of this high frequency content in your snare, because your hi-hats are going to really fill out the high frequency in your mix generally, and sometimes the snare will just muddy the hi-hats. So you want to retain the character of the snare, but maybe just reduce the competing frequencies. This is still a pretty big snare as far as like the frequency spectrum goes. But I like it. I like how it sounds. We're going to bring in an EQ. And I'm actually going to place the EQ before the filters. And a lot of modern snares have a lot of resonance. Either at the fundamental or maybe at an overtone of the fundamental. That's how you get those really kind of like clonky sounding snares. And an easy way to achieve that sound when you're making your own snares is just by using some resonant peaks in an EQ. So what we can do is we can bump up and we'll bring down the Q. Let's see, I think we could actually figure out the right frequency if we wanted to, but I'm just going to do this by ear. We'll go here. Push this up. You can see that peak right there. And now what we could do if we wanted, this is maybe a little much here. I'm going to dial this down a little. That sounds like a sort of high-tech snare. We've still got our render key here. No, we don't. We need to render this and select that, render it. And we have our snare now with some EQ. Let's take a look at this. Okay. So we've got this real strong resonant peak, probably at that frequency, whatever it is, around 600 or something. It's hard to tell. This I don't like how you can't always read the numbers. And what we could do is if we wanted to bring that down a little bit, we can just select at 0 crossings, make sure your snap is on. This is why I love RENOISE, because you can really just get very precise with it. And we've already got a negative value on our adjust volume here. We'll just bring this down a little bit. We don't want to go too crazy. That sounds a little more tamed. And then we can take the whole thing and normalize it, trim it. And you can kind of repeat this process and get more contrast out of your sounds by reducing peaks. You can do this with any sound. It's kind of nice if you have the time and the inclination. And then you can get kind of louder, fuller sounds without clipping and without having to get into the vagaries of compression or limiting, which, you know, can be their own cans of worms. We'll just bring this down a little bit more, see if we can squeeze a little bit more out of this. And we got a little bit, I think. Okay, and then you could further affect this however you wanted to, process it, whatever you think. For me, that's a decent enough snare that, you know, it's something you can get away with. Again, you know, these are just examples. Your style is going to differ, your tastes are going to differ, but we're just kind of looking at the bare bones of percussion synthesis here. So let's get into a hi-hat. There are various ways of synthesizing hi-hats. You can use detuned square waves. I like to just use noise, but not kind of the simple. Well, you can do it this way. Let me finish a sentence here for you. You can make a hi-hat in, as simple a way as just using some white noise, which you then put an amplitude envelope on. And that's actually, kind of a passable hi-hat. Let me bring this down here. Doesn't sound bad. Pretty quick, right? And if you want an open hi-hat, the problem with this method is that it doesn't sound particularly metallic. It has the noise elements, which is great, but it doesn't have that kind of metallic clang that hi-hats usually do. So the way I like to go about creating a hi-hat is to start with white noise. And I'm just going to select a section of it. Let's take maybe a 64th. We'll trim this down. And then now we have this kind of looping oscillator. And what I like to do is I just like to fade it out so it becomes even a little clickier and more percussive. And then we're going to pitch it up. Till we find some nice kind of inharmonic noise. And this, I think, is a little too long. So what I'm going to do is I'll just select 1/28th. If it'll let me. What's going on here? Oh, my snap is off. That's what's going on. What's happening? I thought this was longer than that. No, I guess maybe I already have it short. Okay. No, don't mind me. I'm gonna shorten this up a little bit. We'll do that. We'll fade it again. There we go. That's more like what I want to hear. So then I'm basically just hunting for an interesting sound. Kind of like that one. And we'll bring our amplitude envelope back into play here. And then you've got some interesting auxiliary percussion if you want to just leave it at that. But we're not going to leave it at that. We're going to add in some more white noise. And oops, that didn't actually do. Let's do that. And now, so we'll set this as, we'll call it clang. How about that? And then we'll set this as noise. And make sure this is on modulation set 2. And we'll bring an envelope out once again. You could just copy and paste. So now here it's just a matter of finding a sound that you like. I'm just going to go with this one for the sake of brevity. Let's sample this one out. Okay. Now we have our hi-hat. And once you've resampled it, try playing it at different pitches. sometimes you get some interesting unexpected results when playing at different pitches. You can use the voice that you created, play it at different pitches, change the amplitude characteristics, and resample it. If you want, this is basically an open hat. If you wanted a closed hat, you can just resample the same thing with a short envelope. And then you have an open hat and a closed hat that are essentially, sound like the same instrument. Now, you probably want to filter out a lot of the low frequency content here. So let's just put in a filter. Again, we can use our Butterworth 8N high pass. Maybe the 4N. Sounds a little more natural. And that could use some EQ and maybe some post-processing. Sometimes a little reverb can help to create the illusion of a physical instrument. But you get the idea. It's pretty easy to create your own drum sounds, and then you have unique samples that you can use again and again as you wish. Nobody else is going to sound like you. You have infinite library at your capacity, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. So that's what I got for you guys today. I hope this was useful or informative or interesting. Go out there and make lots of music, and we'll catch you next time. All right, peace.